We had barely spent meaningful time together in months, and they were not the kind of people who reached out simply because they missed me. Still, I said yes. A small, foolish part of me wanted to believe something had shifted. I told myself maybe enough time had passed. Maybe age had softened them. Maybe, for one evening at least, we could sit together without the usual judgments hiding under every smile. I was wrong. The moment I stepped into the restaurant, I felt it. Not from anything obvious at first, but from the atmosphere around the table. My older sister, Selena, smiled when she saw me, but there was no warmth in it. My younger brother, Trevor, glanced out the window toward the parking lot and asked whether I was still driving that ancient SUV. He said it casually, but the way he said it made everyone understand the joke before he even finished it. Someone laughed. Then Selena added that she hoped the menu had enough affordable options so I would not feel uncomfortable. The table responded with soft chuckles, the kind people make when they want cruelty to pass as humor. Everyone laughed, except me. They thought I did not notice the little glances they exchanged with one another. They thought I did not hear the comments tucked quietly between subjects. But I noticed every single one of them. I always did. I had spent years learning how to hear what people meant, even when they were too polished to say it directly. Still, I kept a calm expression on my face. I had learned long ago that defending myself never changed their minds. If anything, it only encouraged them. The more I explained myself, the more they took it as weakness. The more I justified my choices, the more convinced they became that their assumptions must have been right. So I did what I had taught myself to do over the years. I ordered my dinner. I answered questions with short, measured replies. I let them believe what they wanted to believe. They saw my simple clothes and decided I must be struggling. They saw my old SUV and took it as proof that I had never gotten very far in life. They noticed that I never talked about money, and because silence makes insecure people imaginative, they filled in the blanks with a story that made them feel superior. In their version of my life, I was the disappointing one, the one who had somehow fallen behind, the one who needed sympathy, maybe even pity, the one they could joke about because it made them more comfortable with themselves. What they never understood was that I had stopped trying to impress anyone years ago. After my husband died, my priorities changed in ways I could never fully explain to people who measured success by appearances. Grief strips away performances. It teaches you which things matter and which things only make noise. I stopped caring about looking wealthy. I stopped caring about proving anything. I focused on my work, protected my peace, spent carefully, and built my life in quiet layers. I did not need expensive symbols to confirm what I already knew about the life I had made for myself. To them, restraint looked like failure. To me, it looked like freedom. Dinner dragged on with the usual rhythm of disguised insults and false concern. Selena made a comment about how practical I had always been, the kind of compliment that sounds harmless until you hear the condescension beneath it. Trevor spent 10 minutes talking about a luxury package he had added to his newest car, pausing every so often like he expected me to admire him. My mother, Elaine, wore that soft expression she liked to use when speaking about me in front of other people, as if I were delicate or unfortunate. "We all worry about Nadia," she said at one point, stirring her drink. "She has always been so private. It is hard to know when someone is carrying more than they can manage." She said it as though she were kind. She said it as though I had ever once asked her for help. My father, Roland, did what he always did. He looked down. He adjusted his fork. He let the moment pass without stepping in. Silence had been his chosen language my entire life, especially when silence protected him from taking sides. He never openly joined the cruelty, but he never interrupted it either. After enough years, that difference stops mattering. I stayed polite. I stayed composed. I let the night move forward. Then, after the plates were cleared, Selena suggested that we all stop by the bank because she had some paperwork to handle before the branch closed. She said it casually, like an afterthought, as if it were simply the most practical next step. Everyone agreed. I went along quietly. None of them knew that walking into that bank would change the entire evening. Before that night, before the silence in the bank lobby, before the shock on their faces, there had been years of smaller moments that led us there. That awkwardness did not arrive out of nowhere. It was built slowly, piece by piece, through every insult that was disguised as concern and every assumption that was made without question. Selena had always been especially gifted at saying cruel things with a smile. If I wore the same wool coat for more than a couple of winters, she would ask whether I wanted her to take me shopping. If I brought a homemade dish to a gathering, she would laugh lightly and say I was still determined to save every penny. She knew exactly how to say these things in a tone that let her pretend innocence if anyone ever challenged her. Trevor was different, but no kinder. He liked displays. He liked comparisons. He liked mentioning the price of things when he knew I could hear him. He talked about new watches, expensive trips, custom furniture, renovated spaces, club memberships, weekend getaways, always glancing at me to see whether I reacted. He seemed to draw comfort from believing he had outgrown me, outspent me, outshined me. Most days, I gave him nothing. That bothered him more than any argument would have. The part that hurt most was not even them. It was my parents. My father never defended me. My mother performed compassion in a way that somehow felt worse than open criticism. She liked saying things such as, "We should all make sure Nadia is doing all right," or, "She never asks for anything," which can sometimes mean she needs the most help. People used to think those statements made her sound generous. I knew what they really were: pity wrapped in performance. Over time, I stopped expecting anything different. I attended birthdays, holiday dinners, anniversaries, and family events because avoiding them would only create more drama, and at the time, peace mattered more to me than confrontation. I came, I smiled, I listened, and I left. I carried the hurt privately because I understood that some rooms do not become kinder just because you tell the truth inside them. Weeks later, Selena called the family with another announcement. Our late grandmother's house was finally being sold, and everyone needed to meet with the attorney to sign the remaining legal documents. Selena sounded organized, self-important, and far too pleased with herself. She spoke as though she alone were holding the entire family together through this complicated process. Before ending the call, she added that we should all stop by the bank afterward because there were some financial forms connected to the sale. Something in her voice made me pause. It was subtle, but I knew my sister. She only sounded that confident when she believed she was in control of the outcome. The bank visit was not random. It was part of something. I did not know every detail yet, but I knew enough to recognize the setup. Later, I learned that Selena and Trevor had already spent time discussing what they expected would happen. They had convinced themselves that I would struggle with the legal fees tied to the property transfer. They assumed I might hesitate, stall, or quietly admit that I could not cover my share. At some point, they even began planning how they would respond if I asked the family for help. They had built an entire scene in their minds before I ever arrived. I never corrected them. There was no point. People like that do not listen when the truth interrupts a story that flatters them. So I agreed to the meeting and waited for the day to come. When that morning finally arrived, I felt no anxiety. I dressed simply, as I always did: a navy blouse, tailored slacks, low heels, and the same leather portfolio I had used for years whenever I handled important business. There was nothing flashy about me, and I preferred it that way. Modesty has a way of making arrogant people careless. They stop paying attention. They stop imagining you might be more than they assumed. By the time I reached the attorney's office, everyone else was already there. The documents concerning my grandmother's house were arranged across a polished conference table. The meeting itself went smoothly enough. The attorney reviewed the terms, answered a few questions, pointed to the necessary signatures, and moved the process along with practiced efficiency. I read every page carefully before signing my name. The others seemed impatient to be finished. Selena kept glancing at the clock. Trevor tapped a pen against the table. My mother whispered twice about how exhausting legal matters could be. My father nodded along as if paperwork itself had wronged him. Once the final signature was in place, Selena stood with a smile and announced that the bank was next. Nobody questioned it. We all left together. On the drive there, the conversation turned openly toward money. Selena mentioned how quickly legal expenses could pile up after a property sale. Trevor brought up hidden costs and surprise obligations that always seemed to appear after inheritance matters were settled. Their voices were loud enough to ensure I heard every word. It did not feel like conversation. It felt like bait. I looked out the window and said nothing. A few minutes later, Selena turned slightly toward me with that polished expression she wore when she wanted to seem innocent. "Everything should be manageable for you, right?" she asked. I met her eyes and answered simply, "I am not worried." She raised her eyebrows, clearly unsatisfied, but said nothing more. When we pulled into the parking area, I noticed how relaxed everyone seemed. Too relaxed. There was almost an air of anticipation among them, as though they believed they were about to witness some revealing moment. They thought that inside those doors, I would be exposed. What they did not know was that I had been to that branch many times before. I knew the layout. I knew several of the employees. I knew the manager personally. And I knew exactly why I needed to be there that afternoon. I had simply never told my family any of that. My financial life was not a topic I discussed at dinner tables full of judgment. As we walked toward the entrance, I took one slow breath and followed them inside. I had nothing to fear. The only people walking into that building with false expectations were the ones beside me. The shift happened almost immediately. The moment we entered the lobby, the branch manager looked up from the far side of the floor, saw me, and smiled with unmistakable recognition. He moved toward us before anyone else could speak. "Good afternoon, Miss Hale," he said warmly, extending his hand. "It is wonderful to see you again." His tone was genuine, respectful, familiar. I shook his hand and smiled back. "Good to see you too, Mr. Whitmore." "I was not expecting you today," he said, "but I have already had everything prepared from your earlier request. If you have a few minutes, we can review it in my office." "That would be perfect," I replied. The silence behind me was immediate. I turned just enough to catch their faces. Selena's expression had hardened into confusion. Trevor frowned like he thought he had misheard something. My mother blinked, momentarily stripped of her practiced composure. My father stood still, looking from the manager to me, as though trying to solve a problem that had appeared without warning. Mr. Whitmore turned courteously toward them. "Please make yourselves comfortable," he said. "Ms. Hale will not be long." Then he guided me down the hallway toward one of the private offices. As we passed the teller stations, more recognition followed. "Good afternoon, Ms. Hale. Welcome back. It is nice to see you again." I greeted each employee by name where I could. They had always treated me with consistency, professionalism, and kindness. It was a relationship built over years, not spectacle. Behind me, I could feel my family watching. Inside the office, Mr. Whitmore closed the door and invited me to sit. A folder already waited on the desk. "I have gathered the files you asked for," he said. "Everything is ready for your review." "Thank you," I answered. "I appreciate how quickly you and your team handled it." "It is always a pleasure working with you," he replied. That sentence alone would have been enough to destabilize the version of me my family had spent years protecting in their minds. But it was only the beginning. As he opened the file, I could still picture their expressions in the lobby. They had expected to watch me stumble through a financial inconvenience. Instead, they had seen a bank manager greet me like a long-standing client whose time mattered. Outside the office, I later learned, Selena had quietly approached one of the employees and asked whether they knew me. The employee had smiled politely and said, "Ms. Hale has been one of our valued clients for many years." That single sentence had only deepened the confusion. Inside the office, the truth unfolded without drama. The documents Mr. Whitmore reviewed were not ordinary forms, not loan applications, not emergency arrangements, and certainly not signs of distress. They included investment portfolio summaries, trust structures, philanthropic allocations, endowment updates, and records connected to financial plans that had been built carefully over time. He spoke in a calm, professional tone, pointing out revisions, confirming authorizations, and walking me through recent updates attached to my accounts. He referenced decisions already made, instructions already filed, and programs already funded under structures bearing my name. At one point, he reviewed annual distributions tied to several initiatives I had quietly supported for years. One was the Bright Path Scholars Fund, which provided educational assistance to students whose families could not afford university costs. Another was the Cedar Haven Enterprise Grant, created to help small local business owners survive difficult seasons without predatory debt. Another was the Second Dawn Widows Initiative, a fund especially close to my heart, created to offer practical support to women rebuilding their lives after losing spouses. He also referenced support channels connected to the Harborlight Family Relief Trust, which helped military and veteran households during sudden hardship. He spoke of all of this as though it were ordinary. To him, it was. To my family, standing within earshot and trying to understand what they were witnessing, it must have felt like the floor had shifted beneath them. Selena no longer wore her usual expression of polished control. Trevor's smirk had disappeared entirely. My mother looked as though she wanted to speak but could not figure out how. My father remained silent, though his silence now carried something different. Not indifference, not comfort. Something closer to dawning comprehension. Mr. Whitmore continued. He thanked me for my continued trust in the bank. He acknowledged the consistency of my long-term planning. He mentioned that the institutions tied to my accounts appreciated my discretion and reliability. No one in that room heard him describe me as lucky. No one heard him speak as though I had stumbled into comfort by accident. Everything in his tone made one thing obvious. I was not there seeking approval, assistance, or permission. I was there as someone who had quietly built enough stability to guide resources outward into the lives of other people. The silence around us deepened. Every joke they had told about my clothes, every comment about my car, every assumption about my savings, my work, my choices, my silence. Those things must have come rushing back to them all at once. I did not need to defend myself. Facts were doing that for me. And facts, when calmly presented, can be far more devastating than anger. When the review was finished, we returned to the main area. That was when the second shift happened. If their first reaction had been shock, their second was adjustment. Selena was the first to recover enough to speak, but her tone had changed completely. She said my name softly, almost carefully, as though she had always used it with affection. Trevor stepped closer and attempted a smile that never fully settled on his face. My mother's posture changed too. She suddenly looked more attentive, more invested, more eager to be seen in the right light. Even my father, who had spent most of his life on the safe side of silence, seemed to sense that something in the family had rearranged itself. Selena began talking about how important family was. Trevor brought up old childhood memories, selecting them with suspicious tenderness, trying to sound sincere. He spoke about how much he had admired me growing up, which was almost impressive in its audacity, considering how often he had mocked me in adulthood. My mother said she had always known I would do well in life. That sentence stayed with me. Always known. Not once in all those years had she defended me with that certainty when others were belittling me. Not once had she stood between me and their assumptions. Yet now, with proof standing in the room between us, she reached for a history that had never existed. My father nodded and added that he was proud of the way I had handled myself over the years. Over the years. The same years during which he had remained silent while I was dismissed at his own table. What changed most was not their words, but the urgency beneath them. The people who had treated me like an afterthought were now trying to reposition themselves inside my life as though they had always belonged there. I listened without interrupting. They offered apologies, though not one of them named the specific wound they were apologizing for. They spoke in general terms: misunderstandings, wrong impressions, things said in passing, family tensions, difficult seasons. It was all language designed to soften the truth without admitting it. Selena said she hoped we could move forward together. Trevor said he was sorry if some things had come across the wrong way. My mother said families sometimes fail to appreciate one another until life reveals what truly matters. My father said little, but kept nodding as if agreement itself could revise the past. I accepted their words with calm courtesy, but I did not return their warmth. Something inside me had already recognized the difference between regret and opportunity. Their sudden kindness was not born from reflection. It was born from discovery. They had not changed because they understood the harm they caused. They had changed because the story they told about me was no longer useful. That truth became even clearer in the weeks that followed. After the day at the bank, they did not step back to reflect on their behavior. They leaned forward. The distance in their voices vanished, but what replaced it was not love. It was expectation. Selena approached me first, privately and very carefully. She began by talking about stress, responsibility, and how difficult it had become to manage everything. Then the subject narrowed. Her husband's business, she explained, had gone through a rough period. There had been setbacks, cash flow issues, some unfortunate timing, and a few commitments that had not worked out as expected. At first, she phrased it like she was only confiding in me. Then came the real point. She hinted that the right investment at the right moment could keep the business alive and even help it expand again. She described it as a chance to preserve something important. Her tone suggested partnership, but underneath it was entitlement. She was not asking whether I believed in the business. She was testing how quickly I would step in. Trevor came next. He was less polished, more restless. He admitted he had made mistakes, though he never named them plainly. He spoke vaguely about pressure, bills, timing, and bad decisions that had stacked up over time. Piece by piece, the truth emerged. Debt. More of it than he wanted anyone to know. More of it than he could easily manage on his own. He tried to make it sound temporary, but his eyes told another story. He wanted rescue. My parents followed not long after. They were more indirect than my siblings, but no less obvious. They talked about family unity. They talked about staying connected. They talked about how important it was for loved ones to help one another when life became difficult. Family takes care of family, my mother said. My father agreed. Neither of them named a number. Neither of them made a specific request. They did not have to. The meaning was clear enough. They expected me to absorb the financial weight they had always assumed I could never even carry for myself. I listened. That was all I did at first. I let each of them speak. I let the shape of their expectations fill the room. Not once during those conversations did anyone ask how I felt. Not once did anyone ask what I wanted. Not once did anyone pause long enough to wonder what years of judgment had cost me. Every road led back to money, and in that realization, something in me settled completely. It was not anger. It was clarity. Money had not changed me. It had only exposed them. When they thought I had nothing to offer, I was easy to dismiss. Once they understood that I had something they valued, their tone transformed overnight. I did not argue with any of them. I simply waited until they were finished. Then I told them, as calmly as I could, that the decisions they were discussing had already been made. I explained that my financial planning was not open-ended. It was not a pool of resources waiting for relatives to assign new meaning to it. My long-term arrangements had been structured carefully, legally, and intentionally, well before any of these conversations took place. As I spoke, I watched their faces change again. This time, the shift was from hope to disbelief. They had assumed influence was still possible. They thought perhaps warmth, apology, or pressure might create room where none existed. They were wrong. I told them that months earlier, I had finalized the distribution paths for much of what I had built. Those choices were not impulsive. They were the result of years of reflection, experience, and purpose. The resources they had suddenly begun to imagine for themselves had already been committed toward things I believed in. I told them that continued support would go to the Bright Path Scholars Fund. I told them that additional allocations had already been arranged for the Cedar Haven Enterprise Grant. I told them that the Second Dawn Widows Initiative would continue expanding because I knew exactly what it meant to lose stability after loss and rebuild without enough hands reaching back. I also told them that I had directed future support toward practical community programs that helped families stand on their own feet rather than depend on last-minute rescue. I did not say any of this to wound them. I said it because it was true. And the truth mattered more than preserving their comfort. Selena looked as though she wanted to interrupt several times, but she never did. Trevor lowered his eyes and stared at the floor. My mother seemed unable to decide whether she was more offended or more embarrassed. My father stood still, absorbing it all in the silence he had always preferred. Only now, that silence had nothing safe left to hide behind. I continued without anger. I told them I had no desire to repeat the old cycle of assumption, disappointment, and quiet resentment. I told them my choices had been made in alignment with my values, not in reaction to anyone else's emergencies. I told them I wished them well, but I would not reorganize my life to become the answer to problems they had created while barely respecting me. When I finished, the room was silent again. But this silence was not the one from the bank lobby. This was the silence of realization. Not realization about who I was, realization about what they had already lost. After that, things began to unravel in ways that were painful to watch, even from a distance. Selena's situation deteriorated first. The business she had hoped someone else would stabilize did not recover. Costs kept rising, revenue did not. Without a financial cushion arriving from outside, she was forced to cut corners, scale back staff, and let go of the image of success she had worked so hard to project. She became sharper around the edges, more tired, less polished. The confidence that once carried her through every room began to crack under pressure. Trevor's struggles surfaced differently. Debt does not disappear because it is hidden, and eventually, the structures he had built to delay consequences began to collapse. He had to face collections, overdue balances, damaged credibility, and the exhausting humiliation of untangling a mess he had hoped someone else might quietly erase. For the first time in his life, he had to confront the weight of his own decisions without expecting admiration, excuses, or rescue to soften the impact. My parents watched all of this with a growing sense of helplessness. And somewhere inside that helplessness, I believe they finally began to understand that the way they had treated me over the years had cost them more than a comfortable relationship. Their favoritism, their silence, their willingness to let one child be mocked while protecting the pride of the others, those things had created a distance they could no longer cross simply by needing me. I did not celebrate any of it. There was no satisfaction in watching people struggle, even when those same people had once dismissed my pain. What I felt was quieter than that, a kind of sober understanding. Actions build futures, patterns have outcomes, and eventually, every unchallenged cruelty arrives somewhere. For the first time in many years, I stopped attending family gatherings. No one confronted me about it directly. Perhaps they sensed that they no longer had the right. Perhaps they feared what honesty would sound like if either side finally spoke without restraint. I did not explain my absence. I did not need to. The quiet away from them felt different from the quiet I had carried among them. It was not the silence of endurance. It was the silence of relief. No more measuring glances. No more disguised pity. No more being invited into rooms where affection depended on usefulness. Instead, I gave my time to people who met me without agenda. My circle became smaller, but it became real. There were colleagues who respected my judgment, friends who listened without trying to rank lives against one another, neighbors and acquaintances who valued steadiness more than performance, people who did not need to be impressed in order to be kind. Work became lighter too, not because the responsibilities changed, but because I was no longer carrying the invisible exhaustion of trying to remain composed in front of those who insisted on misunderstanding me. I could move at my own pace. I could build what mattered. I could make decisions without imagining how they might be interpreted by people who had already decided who I was. With time, several truths became clearer than ever. I learned that silence is not always weakness. Sometimes it is wisdom. Sometimes it is the only shield available in spaces where speaking would only feed those who are committed to not understanding you. I learned that simplicity is not evidence of failure. Many of the strongest lives are built quietly, without spectacle, without witnesses, without applause. I learned that real success does not announce itself at every opportunity. It does not depend on envy. It does not need validation from people who confuse visibility with worth. Most of all, I learned that once someone has decided to see you through the narrow lens of their own insecurity, explanations rarely help. You can hand them facts, history, sacrifice, discipline, grief, growth, and still they will cling to whatever version of you protects their ego. Until, of course, reality becomes too visible to deny. Months passed. I heard occasional updates about my family through indirect channels. They felt distant by then, like news from a chapter of life I had already closed. Selena was still trying to recover what she could. Trevor was still sorting through consequences. My parents had grown quieter. Whether that quiet came from regret, age, or disappointment, I cannot say. By then, it no longer belonged to me to interpret them. The deeper lesson stayed with me long after the details faded. Blood alone does not create safety. Shared history alone does not create respect. Family, in the truest sense, is not defined by names on paper or seats at a holiday table. It is defined by trust, by dignity, by how people hold your humanity when they believe you have nothing to offer them. Without those things, closeness becomes performance, and performances always collapse eventually. The people who once looked down on me did not lose access to money they had never earned. They lost something far more valuable. They lost access to a version of me that once cared deeply about being accepted by them. They lost the part of me that kept showing up, hoping one good evening might finally feel like belonging. They lost the woman who still believed patience alone could soften contempt into love. That woman is gone now. Not because bitterness replaced her, because peace did. In the end, what mattered most was not the shock in the bank, not the apology in altered voices, not even the moment they realized they could not claim what I had already chosen to place elsewhere. What mattered was the freedom that came after. I no longer needed to explain myself to people who had spent years refusing to see me clearly. I no longer needed to prove that quiet discipline could build a strong life. I no longer needed to trade my peace for proximity to those who only valued me when they thought I might benefit them.